God's grace and peace to you, friends. I invite you now to join in a time of celebration, of worship, of listening and learning, of giving thanks to God for all that has been done. Let us worship together. Our scripture today comes from the Gospel of Matthew in the 22nd chapters, verses 1 through 14. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is made ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, maltreated them, and even killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed the murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' The slaves went out to the streets and gathered all who they found, both good and bad, and so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed there was one man who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. And the king said to him and to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Here ends our reading from the Gospel of Matthew.
Sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of care and bids me at my Father's throne, make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and oft escape the tempter's snare by your return, sweet hour of prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, the joys I feel, the bliss I share, of
Do you ever wonder about the question reporters ask when there's a big Hollywood event and people are walking down the red carpet? Or there's an important occasion and we obsess over one thing in particular. Typically has nothing to do with anything really important. But the question in everyone's mind, or at least what they think we want to hear, is, who are you wearing? Is the dress made by someone famous? What kind of thing does this piece of clothing say about you as a human? Is it so fancy that it lets everyone know that you're of a special status? Or is it a chic designer so we know you're hip and cool and going to be one of those people who everyone looks to? All of these things we try to draw conclusions about by what someone is wearing. Many of you probably grew up with the line, the clothing makes the man or the person, right? And we do, whether we mean to or not, we judge people on how they're dressed. And in certain occasions, there are certain ways you dress. In certain occasions, there are ways you don't dress. If you were going over with someone really important, you wouldn't show up, most likely, in ripped up jeans or shorts and a hoodie. You just wouldn't do it. You would dress nice. We talk sometimes about what are church clothes. Yeah, there's nothing in the Bible about that, just to be clear. We talk about if the event is formal, semi-formal. What is this dress supposed to be? And clothing does say a lot about a person. It may not say anything important, but it tells you things. When you see certain, we'll call them uniforms, you understand something to be true. If you see someone, say, in a lab coat, you think, ooh, scientist, doctor, they're smart because they're in a lab coat. If you see someone with the reflective gear, you're like, public safety of some sort. They might be construction. They may take care of garbage. They may be a builder. But it's so you can see them, right? The clothing serves a purpose. If you see an apron, you think, this person's a cook, something like this, right? And if you're a cook, you might have funny aprons for different things like this. If you're wearing something like a hat with stripes, like an engineer, you'd say, oh, must be a railroad worker, right? All of these things tell us something about someone that may or may not have anything to do with who they are, but maybe what they are. It's who they're wearing, as it were. Jesus, in this story, has been arguing with the religious establishment. Not just Jewish people, but we're talking about Pharisees, potentially the Levites, the scribes, the Sadducees. He's arguing with the religious elite who are in control of the church, who have an outsized sway on people's lives by saying, you can do this and you cannot do this. And he's been, well, not the most polite to them. He's kind of called them out repeatedly. He has two stories he tells right before this that may give a little bit more context to where in the world this story comes out of. He has just told the parable of the two sons. The short form, a man says to his two boys, I need your help out in the vineyard to get the harvest ready. And the first son says, really? Come on, Dad, I'm not doing this today. The father says, okay. Goes to the other son and says, son, I need you to come out and help. And he says, of course, Dad, I'd love to. We fast forward, and the son who was so all excited about coming out has still not shown up. And the complaining grumbler is out yet in the fields doing the work he was called to do. And then Jesus tells a further story that builds on this and said, we call it the parable of the wicked tenants. A man has a vineyard preparing the harvest. It's being watched by other people in his stead. The man who owns the vineyards comes back and sends his people out to say, okay, let it go. Give me what's mine. And they refuse to give authority. And in some cases, they take the people this landowner sends, and they beat and kill his servants. And they say, it's ours now. You're out of luck. You can't have it. Jesus is telling these stories after arguing with the leaders of the church. And it's clear to them that he is not just randomly telling stories. He's going after them in parable form. He's speaking, yes, probably to the disciples too who are watching this whole thing unfold, but he is going to town on the leaders of the church saying, basically, you've been entrusted with the keys to the kingdom, and this is what you have to return to me? You'll find that Matthew frequently likes to draw on these motifs. So in the story for today then, we get this idea of a man. the king who has a wedding. And a wedding in the ancient days was not just a thing you go to. It's not like, oh, there's a family wedding, we got to make an appearance. This would be, think of the importance, both socially, the importance both economically, communally. This is like your own child getting married. This is not something you're going to miss. Everyone who should come, especially invited by the king, for the prince, as it were, should be overjoyed to come and celebrate. And yet, the invitations go out. The fatted calf, a symbol of God's plenty, has been killed and set out as a sign of gracious hospitality to all. And people are like, I got a farm to run, I got to work, I got a t-ball game to go to, whatever it happens to be. And they say, we just can't make it. And they come back and say to the king, I'm sorry, Your Highness, they won't come, they're too busy. And he says, go back out and tell them they're coming. This isn't just in the story of a people that don't want to go to a social function. To deny the king is a slight beyond all slights. In the ancient world, ignoring what the king had to do or blowing off something like this could quite literally cost you everything, including your life. These are people doing something intentionally spiteful, if you will. And the next time the servants come out and say, like, hey man, the king says you got to get here, they kill the servants in the ultimate humiliation and attack against the king. Early hearers would have been like, what? No, that would have never happened, right? Because the king in the story then goes and comes and kills them and burns their city to the ground. Again, way over the top reaction. Not saying it never happened before, but that's not how it goes when you feud with royalty, as it were, typically. But the people do terrible things, and their response is swift and terrible. And the king says, fine then. If the people who I created this feast for to celebrate my son won't come, take everyone. I don't care. It doesn't matter who they are. All are invited. The reality is, when all of the people are invited and they turn down a date with an expansive banquet and celebration with the king, the hearers of this would have known right away that this is not a story that there's any truth to in the sense of facts. And then they hear about the king overreacting and burning his city to the ground, and they'd be like, you got to be kidding me. This is ridiculous. This is a soap opera. Come on. And then Jesus goes a little further and says, all were gathered in, but the king saw one guest, one man without his wedding robe. Quick pause, a wedding robe, there are cultures that still do this, but in the ancient world especially, the wedding robe would have been something to denote a thing. So it wouldn't have mattered your class or your status because you'd wear this robe to show off, to be elegant. It would be something subdued and proper. It'd be like showing up for a huge red carpet event in flip-flops and a swimsuit. You just don't do it. And so this man comes, and the king sees this man and says, how did you get in here without being dressed properly at this banquet I'm throwing? The man never responds, but they take him, they bind him, and they throw him out. The people would have heard this and said, what is going on here? That is not how a king would act. That's not how any of this works. Hence, we know that the parable Jesus tells is not meant to be taken literally. So I want to go back to who are you wearing, that question we started with. In the ancient world, clothing had a very specific purpose. Yes, there were the clothes you wore everywhere, but we have different outfits we would put on, right? We have work uniforms sometimes. We have very specific things, for a black tie event, whatnot. All of these things. And the clothing tells you something about both status, but it also tells you something about the role the person plays. And in the ancient world, there are a number of stories, much like this man who did not have his wedding robe, where robes play an important part. Now, you probably can think right to yourself, who wears robes in modern society? I don't mean a bathrobe, I mean like one of these. Robes are typically clergy, religious celebration of some sort, maybe a choir robe, something like this, or it happens to be someone who is a judge or something along these lines, right? It's a very formal piece of clothing. Think for a second of some characters in Scripture, right? One should come right to your head who wore a robe, right? Joseph and his special robe, or the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, if you like to get very Andrew Lloyd Webber on this. But you have this idea that Joseph has this extravagant robe that shows his father's love and praise and status. The priests all through the Torah also are told, this is how you will wear the robe, and the robe will denote your special role as my people, as the leaders of this. There's two other stories of robes that I think are very important that we might have forgotten. One is the parable of the loving father. The son who has blown everything comes back to his father, and the father's response in his great love and generosity is, get him a ring and a robe. The ring signifying that he is part of the family, and the robe signifying that he is important. That no matter whatever else has befallen him, that robe says, you're part of us. The other spot where you might, if you like old movies, might know the old movie The Robe. Otherwise, the scene where Jesus is being mocked before his crucifixion, they put on an elegant purple robe to show how important he is before, well, they kill him. The robe then, whether it be wedding or be a formal wear or some sort of liturgical piece, signifies something. That clothing has something to do. Now, this banquet that is full of God's hospitality, where those who were originally called ignore it, God opens the king, God opens the doors open and says, everyone is invited. With the footnote, but if you're coming to the banquet, be prepared, be ready. Put on that wedding robe, put on the robe so you know and that people know who you're wearing, as it were. There are a couple texts in the Bible about clothing that I think are important. I'll share a couple with you. In Galatians 3, we read, as many of you are baptized into Christ, you have clothed yourselves with Christ. In Ephesians 6, you might remember this from Sunday school when you're little. There's the story of the armor of God, how you're to proceed in the world, and it's the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness, shoes to proclaim the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Those things to prepare you to go out and to find a harsh world. And in one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture, in Colossians 3, we read, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. What you're wearing, who you're wearing, speaks to who you belong to in Scripture. This man without the wedding robe comes into the great banquet, God's gracious invitation to all, and comes not dressed in the robe of Christ, full of compassion and kindness, humility, meekness, and love. Instead, he comes in unprepared, definitely not in the place he ought to be. Matthew very clearly says, if you're not prepared, don't expect a warm welcome. And there's some odds about what this hospitality looks like. If you were going to a dinner party and you were asked to bring wine to the dinner party and instead you brought a cold block of tofu, how would you be received? If you were asked to come to a mission project on a work site and they said dress to do some heavy labor and you came in a sundress with a parasol, how would you be received? The reality is, for Matthew as he tells the story, when one is invited into the kingdom of God, this great banquet that the king is hosting, one best be prepared. One best put on the armor of God. One best put on the clothing of Christ, that robe that denotes you as one who is living as you are supposed to. Matthew says all are invited, but not everyone gets to stay. Everyone is invited to the banquet, but you have to make the choice whether you put on your robe or not. As Matthew tells us, what we do as people of faith matters, which means what we wear in sight of the world matters. How we behave in this world as followers of Christ, whether we think anyone's watching or not, tells others who are not part of this great banquet already the nature of Christ. So when you say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, and then you do terrible things, people say, is that what a Christian is like? Where's the wedding robe? Over and over again through Matthew, you hear these stories of how are you prepared? The hospitality, the welcome is out for everyone to come. But in that hospitality, if you think you're coming, you want to accept this invitation into the kingdom of God, it requires something of you. You have to walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk. Matthew's parable about this man without his wedding robe, about this king with the fierce anger, about the people who slight him, but mostly about this gracious welcome to all people regardless of status, whether they deserve to be there, whether they are good or bad, reminds us time and time again of God's broad, persistent, generous invitation. But Matthew, unlike Luke's story where everyone's happy and it has a happy ending, Matthew points to saying, what you wear to this invitation says something. Are you coming with respect, with humility, with kindness and compassion, humility, with love? Or are you coming to spite the host? The reality is each of us, you and me, have been called into God's gracious kingdom. There are no requirements to come, but there are expectations. If you want to take in God's hospitality in the kingdom, God asks, calls, encourages, pushes you, if you will, into wearing that robe that says, I have put on the robe of Christ. And when people see me and understand what I look like and do, that robe of Christ with meekness and humility and compassion and kindness and most of all love matters. You cannot be hospitable if you won't accept hospitality. You cannot be righteous if you're unwilling to be righteous with others. Matthew tells us, you're all invited, but dress the part. Amen.
Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art.
And when I think that God his Son not sparing sent him to die, I scarce can take it in. Then on that cross, his burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin.
Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come with shouts of acclamation and take me home, what joy will fill my heart. Then I shall bow in humble adoration and then proclaim, my God, how my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art.
Let us be in a time of prayer. God, it is in you that we live, move, breathe, and exist. We give you thanks for this very day, this very time that we gather together, that we come as one people to celebrate your goodness, to give thanks for the great gifts and blessings you pour out upon us, to remember all that you have done, to remember that you have called each of us by name, to be your very hands and feet upon this earth, to do the work you have created us to do, to bring your beloved community, to build your kingdom, to bring all that is love closer. Help us do this hard work, God. May your word guide us. May music enlighten us. May all that it is that we do as your people bring pleasure and joy to this world. We would ask this day that you hold on to those among us who are struggling, for those who are having difficult times. May their load be lightened. For those who are dealing with sickness, may they find healing and peace. For those who are alone, may they find companionship. For those who struggle in a myriad of different ways, may your presence be a balm to all that ails us. We give great thanks, God, for all of the gifts you have poured out, for all the mercies, for the countless times we have been forgiven, for all the times you have reached out and lifted us back up. Lead us this day more fully onto the path that Christ walked first for us, the path that Christ showed us what it was to live and live abundantly. Let us follow his example. Let us pray as the Holy One taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but only lean on Jesus' name, on Christ the
And now, my friends, you have heard who we were created to be, how God has called each one of us by name through song, through scripture, through worship together, the sharing of our gifts with one another, the recognition that God is present among us. I encourage you, in the name of the Holy One, to go out into the world and be the hands and feet of the living God to all you encounter. Go in peace and serve the Lord. Amen.